Thanks everybody so much for coming. As many of you know, this is a homecoming for me. New Orleans is where I was born and raised. And so I love the New Orleans Book Festival. I love what the Book Festival has become. I love that it's an excuse to see my parents and get some pettifours and cinnamon rolls from Adrian's Bakery and eat some gumbo and some po' boys and all the things, just stuff myself before I go back to Maryland. And it is a real honor and pleasure to be in conversation with a sort of literary hero of mine, Tracy K. Smith, whose poems and essays and memoirs have served as such a example for me in terms of like what it means to write across genre, what it means to write across, to bend genre and to not be confined to like specific demarcations of like what is a poem, what is an essay, what is memoir, what is criticism, but so beautifully blends it all together in her work, and it's just really exciting for me. This whole weekend, I'm like, man, these 5 years ago, these people like existed in another universe, and now I get to sit on stage with them. So I'm really excited to be here. And I'm excited to talk some about the way our work is in conversation, and I was rereading To Free the Captives, which is your most recent book, as I came down to New Orleans, and one of the things, there's so many things I love about it. I want to start with your framing of like the free and the freed, which I thought was such a beautiful and subtle way to bring forth the different ways that certain groups of people experience and have experienced what we conceive as freedom in the world. Could you talk a little bit about like that framing and how you came up with it?
I don't think it should have come as a surprise to me, but to find myself writing myself toward the corner where these two different terms sat felt startling. Instinctively, I understand that we experience America differently depending on who we are, depending on what positions we occupy, what memories or histories we hold close. But in thinking about some of the experiences of my father and his father and older brothers and grandparents in war, in the military, I realized there are a couple of really bold categories that I hadn't allowed myself to think about. And so what I believe is that in America, the sense of freedom for people who appear to descend from histories of power or ownership, people who descend from histories of maybe dominion over others, is something that's boundless and something that we've been taught to accept as indivisible from their very persons. And many of us grow up believing this is the freedom that's we all have access to or opportunity for. But I think in reality, there's another category that many of us descend from or have been placed into, which is what I think of as freed. We appear to descend from histories of violence, of subjugation, of enslavement. We appear to descend from patterns of having been acted upon by the free. And in practical terms, what it means is there are limits to what will be tolerated from us in terms of demands or requests or even interventions into the sense of the American project. And that really disheartened me. I looked at the experience of my father's eldest brothers in World War II, and the sense, like many of the soldiers that enlisted at that time or were drafted at that time, was that they were going to prove to the world that freedom is possible, that America could be a bastion of the freedom and democracy that it professes. And of course, they came home to, Jim Crow, if they were in the South. The promise of the GI Bill wasn't necessarily something that was made good upon for many people. I feel like we can do better. I feel like, to distinguish the categories is one thing, but to think about what it means, even for those who we imagine are free, is that there is some part of the imagination and the energy that is squandered on the feeling that that freedom must be defended against encroachment or contestation. There's some level of investment, I think, in the imagination of everyone in this country in leveraging what freedom or power we have against others to kind of inch up ever higher in the innumerable hierarchies that we consent to. And so, as a poet, I feel like language is an invitation or even a challenge to revise, respond. And so I really want us to think about what makes more sense. How, in this moment in human history, where it feels like time is really speeding up, how our energy could be better directed. And I think that really means, and this is where I want to ask you what you're thinking about in terms of history. I think it means we really have to admit that much of what we as a nation accept as the terms of our, belonging to democracy is riddled with mythology that's very, very counterproductive.
One of the things that I was so struck by in the book and in your comments is thinking about the way that your father's eldest brother, when he went to war, and it was a mechanism, as you said, for him to prove, as it was for some. I mean, this was part of the Double V campaign that Du Bois and so many others advocated for and endorsed, was this sort of victory at home and victory abroad. Black soldiers would go and help the United States and the Allies defeat the sort of Nazi oppressive, authoritarian dictator regimes, and then would come home, and as a result of having proved themselves to having helped liberate the world from fascism, would return and be given plaudits and be celebrated in parades, and would be, we'd be like, how could we ever be so silly to have, had this Jim Crow thing, like, here, sit at the lunch counter, sit at the restaurant, come to the schools, come live next door. And as we know, it didn't end up that way. And one of the things I've been thinking about a lot, my new book project is a similar conceit to my previous one, How the Word is Passed, which is exploring how different historical sites reckon with and fail to reckon with their relationship to the history of slavery, and exploring how sort of iconography and historical landscape of slavery shapes our contemporary understanding of it. I'm kind of taking that frame and now thinking about that in the context of World War II. And so now I am traveling around the country and around the world, going to different World War II historical sites, visiting different World War II monuments that speak to the experiences of different people in the United States and around the world, to try to get an understanding of, well, what are the stories that we tell about World War II that exist beyond the sort of Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks version of it that is the sort of singular version that I was presented with, D-Day, Normandy. And it's not to say that those parts of the story aren't part of the story, but that they are part of the story. They're not the whole story. All to say, one of the things that's so interesting is that I think about my Uncle Lawrence, who's my grandfather's brother, who left Mississippi to go fight in World War II as a means of escaping Jim Crow Mississippi, but also as similar to what you alluded to with your own family of helping be a part of a larger project of proving to the country that they are deserving of freedom, of dignity. And as I've gone to other places, and right now I'm specifically thinking of the Navajo Reservation, where I spent time with some of there are 3 surviving Navajo code talkers. I had the opportunity to spend time with one of them. And then I went to California to the Manzanar internment camp, where tens of thousands of Japanese and Japanese American people were imprisoned in these open-air prisons during the war where we interred 120,000 Japanese and Japanese American people because we ostensibly suspected that they might be spies or have some sort of relationship with the Japanese government that we were fighting, even though history has proven that we had other, reasons for which we did that. But one of the things that comes up when I talk to survivors in those camps, when I talk to the folks in the Navajo reservation, echoes so much of what you heard from your uncle and my uncle, which was this idea that if we do this, we can prove our worthiness, we can prove our Americanness. So much that you had Japanese Americans whose entire families were in these internment camps, who were drafted from the internment camps to go fight for the United States. And some said no, because they were like, why would I go fight for a country that is keeping my entire family in this open-air prison? But some said yes, because they were like, this can be how I prove that we are real Americans, that we're real citizens, that you should take us out of these camps. And for the folks on the Navajo reservation, it was this idea like, this is how we can prove that that we are deserving of a dignity that this country has never given us. This is how we can prove ourselves worthy of resources that this country might give us once we come back. Oh, look at the valor with which they fought. Now maybe we should provide them with social infrastructure that can make their lives better.
Where does the idea come from that there is a logic that governs all of this? And how is it that that logic, there are so many ways when, this enterprise of America, which in our minds we sometimes believe will trust the evidence and recognize that inequality is just a mistake.
Right.
And yet we know there's so much contradiction that's built into, the enterprise of power. It was a necessary recircuiting of logic in order to say we can enslave people because they're not people. And so it's just really, I'm interested in what I've begun to think of as counter logics, because sometimes it feels like the orderly, logical, bureaucratically obedient response to what is wrong is a distraction.
Yeah, and convinces us to believe that we can behave our way out of oppressive systems, right? If only we go fight it, if we go fight in the war, they will stop segregation. If we dress a certain way, they will let us into their schools. If we speak a certain way, they'll want to live next door to, and all of these different sort of ways that follow a logic, as you say, that would suggest if you do X and Y, then A and B will happen. But America has never followed that logic in that way. And it is because there are, the questions of power are not consistent with those, or interested necessarily in questions of behavior. Like access is not contingent on a certain pretext of behavior or engagement. It is instead a desire to hold on to resources, right? Material resources, sort of the resources of the memory. One of the conversations we were having that I had in an earlier panel with Eddie Glaude, Imani Perry, Jesmyn Ward, was just the way in which part of America and part of the mythos of the South is that there is a specific story that many Southerners tell about themselves that is not actually reflective of, that is reflective of a very specific part of Southern memory that doesn't account for the totality and the complexity of what the South is, because part of what shapes historical memory of the South are what archives we're pulling from. And because people are not often pulling from archives that include Black life or Navajo life or whatever the case may be, their understanding of what 17th, 18th, 19th century Southern life was like is not, again, accounting for these other parts of it. And one of the things that you do so beautifully in To Free the Captives is you recognize the limitations of the archive, and you expand it with like, you create like a sort of imaginative archive, one that's pulled from oral histories, one that's pulled from these sort of scraps that exist in history, to piece together parts of stories, both in your family and in American history, that that have not always been part of the sort of larger fabric of the story we tell.
Mm-hmm. I came to the belief that much of what is missing from the historical record is actually evidence of the abundant love that had to be present in order to sustain communities and families and hope, to build. I feel like love is something that you zero in on really beautifully as well when I think about the way that your insight into memorialization and communities that have found ways of recentering themselves within the history of enslavement. I really believe that this is like a vocabulary that maybe, I don't know, I'll just say it. Everything that has been created with that which is not love is what we're witnessing teeter and crumble and present its insustainability. And then I think about this other tool, which is care and love and support, endurance, a sense, what I get very excited about in To Free the Captives, the soul, is this, I think, invincibly strong substance. And I really want to draw that vocabulary into our conversations about civic life, about citizenship.
And it's one of those things where love is, it's hard to describe like the politics of love in that way, right? Like I think love can be one of those things that we talk about and it automatically conjures up something very like fluffy, like not something that is like a foundation, not something that is strong, not something that is it feels impenetrable in some ways. And I think that part of what you're building is like a new, as you say, vocabulary to think of love as this thing that protects, this thing that we build upon, and just like is the reason we're here. You know, just like it is human connection. It is like the time that you spend with people you love. It is the love that you put into yourself, into your soul, into your health, into your body. But it's also interesting because you tap into, like, in some ways, like the absence of love, and what I mean by that is like your mother died when you were 19. Yeah, so when you were young, and so in some ways, you were, I think, like living into and writing into a love. I don't think it would be right to say that left or that disappeared, because the love was still there. But can you talk more about like writing about the other part of love, which is grief, right?
Yeah.
Which is the loss of love or of a loved one.
Yeah, I think, okay, I'm glad you mentioned that word. It's a big part of my practice as a poet. And this book opens with a very honest admission that, having lost both of my parents, a large part of my life, even now, is involved with talking to and listening and hearing from them in a way that I don't think is metaphorical. And so what I believe that grief does, it goes through stages, as we know, but I think one of the things that it does is it acts as almost like a magnet. It gathers up memory, presence, and need, and it draws things near. It makes time capable of holding so much more than we believe. And so a large part of this love I'm talking about is like the material of the archive of Black life. I think it's rooted in the very real and ongoing presence of grief and loss. And it's not just about losing a parent, but it's about being in a community that is made to lose or to sacrifice or to give up or to be in a position of understanding how much has been willfully withheld. That can be a destructive force. But I really believe that there's a temperance and a care that has also been a hallmark of Black life, and it's become something very productive. There's a little story that I tell in the book about a man who was, I think, probably a cousin to my grandmother. His name was Simon Trixie Jr., and during the Depression, he and his family were living within the same community as my grandparents. In fact, I found his name because their houses are next to each other on the census grid. And there's a letter that Simon Trixie wrote to the governor of Alabama one day when he went to work and learned that he and all of the other Black people in his community, whom he refers to as colored, had been laid off. And he writes a letter in good faith to the governor. Can I read that letter?
Please,
His
yeah.
voice is just, it's so full of life. It's so full of the intention to make sure that it isn't a mistake that the governor has, sorry, I want to find them. I should know by now, right?
No, I can never find my page.
Okay, here we go. He wants to make sure it's not some sort of a lack of information that has left his community feeling completely forgotten. So he writes, "Honorable Sir, I am writing you concerning my Reconstruction Finance Corporation job. It is so many meddlers here. Very near all of the colored folks have been cut off, some who hasn't got bread, and at the price now will not be able to get it and have large families. I was cut off this week. I didn't know anything about it until I was told today. I do think that since I'm of age, the folks should have asked me of my condition without taking someone else's word. I have a family of 5, an aged and blind mother to help care for. She's in her late 70s. My wife has a very aged cousin of whom we have to help care for since she hasn't any husband or children or any close relatives to depend on. We only get $1 per day, and groceries are unreasonably high, 35 cents per pack for meal, flour 65 cents for 12 pounds, meat 15 cents per pound for common kind of dry salt. It hasn't been a man on the job that worked any better than I. Either has it been a time that I've been late going on the job. I feel like I haven't been treated just fair and have such responsibilities on myself and several others with large families. It's only a few colored people on the job now. Now, if I have said anything to cause any offense, I humbly ask for apology. Kindly let me hear from you soon regarding this matter, since I need some help or a job. Will work any place. I owe a store account now. Humbly yours, Simon Trixie Sr., Sunflower, Alabama." And I hear in that letter just this sense that maybe I can help them understand. Maybe it's just like a little bit of a misconception. And so I got excited to notice the breadth and the energy and the descriptions and the whole community that's kind of ushered into the letter. And to my mind, that's not only a courageous act in the Jim Crow South, but it's also, a sense of care and investment. And this is the letter that he got back from the governor's, someone in the governor's office named John Peach. "Dear Sir, Governor Miller has referred to me for attention and reply your letter with reference to Reconstruction Finance Corporation job. The amount allowed to Alabama by the Reconstruction Finance Corporation has been reduced. We are working now to get more funds. You should talk over with the people in charge of the matter in your county, your situation, and I am sure they will give careful consideration to it. Yours very truly, John H. Peach, legal advisor to the governor. So that's it. That's where the paper trail ends. And I hear in the, like succinct, door-slamming tone of that letter that, this is not a question to be explored, and it may not even be an accident. And so this man is sent to, the office of people who are unnamed, who may or may not exist, to have the matter addressed and resolved. About 10 years later, or maybe a little bit longer, after the Depression, the census shows that Simon Trixie has moved from the little community of Sunflower to Mobile, and is living with his daughter and her husband and children. And he's gone from being a farmer to being a gardener, working in a nursery. And I think, what my mind does to connect those dots is to say, the door closed, help didn't come, and yet life went on. And grandchildren were born, and there's this sense that something else must be built. I even really appreciate the metaphor of working in a nursery, creating life, tending to fragile things that characterizes what he ended up having to do to make another kind of living. But I feel like that's a story that's, there are countless versions of that story. The archive is full of, the absence of documentation for those kinds of stories. And yet the grief and the loss is melded into something else.
What year is that from?
That letter was written, I think, in 1929.
Okay, so right at the onset of the Depression. Mm-hmm. It's so interesting. I hear that. I remember when I read that for the first time, I was just like, man, I feel like I would have understood what the Great Depression was in a different sort of way, with a different sort of valence, if I had had access to those types of letters, like that type of, if those things had been pulled from the archive. Because, when you're taught about the Great Depression for the first time when you're in, I don't know, 7th grade or something, it's almost abstract, right? It's very statistical. It's, they were like, there was this much unemployment, there was this much, but there's certainly, even amid the statistics and even to the extent that we were, there was this sort of statistical element to it, and then if there was a literary element to it or a human texture element to it, it was always through like a Steinbeck novel, right? Or like something that presented what the Depression was to white Americans in ways that I like the idea that black people were disproportionately impacted by the Great Depression, that black unemployment was twice the rate of white unemployment during the worst depression in the past, economic downturn in the past 100 years, was not something that I was even cognizant of. And even when I learned that, it's such an example of like what it means to take something out of the realm of the abstract and to hear this man, to hear the pleading in his voice, to hear the sort of like, I just need even the smallest amount of additional money to like buy eggs or buy bread, buy food for my family, sort of desperation that exists in that sort of letter. It makes it so much more real. And I think one of the things that I've been talking about over the last couple sessions is just like what it means to present the interiority of Black life in ways that it is not often presented to us. And one of the things that I'm interested in doing that is using landscapes and historical sites and iconography as the entry point with which to think about that interiority. But it's just another example of like, there are opportunities for us to consider the like very real human implications of these sort of larger macro forces in ways that often are that certainly, were not part of the way that I was taught about the Depression or so many of these other periods of history.
I feel like you're doing so much to help train us to look for that, and also to just look at one another and listen to one another so tenderly and attentively. I love the writing because your poet eye and your sense of gesture comes into your writing about history, comes into your description of a landscape or an encounter, or even the way that a guide at one of these sites presents themselves, what they withhold. I feel like a big part of the work that we might seek to do is really opening up a different kind of receptive and attentive capacity, because most of the ways we've been taught to look at one another, America, looking at us within, the community of Blackness, particularly, or thinking about any group of other that has been herded literally into one place and one set of class characteristics. We have to sort of unlearn the brute force of that. The reality is that gaze makes us into tools for a perspective that privileges the very, very few. And even somebody who may not feel like they belong in a category of other suffers from that kind of gaze. And that's something that I'm grateful for your seeing. Can you talk a little bit about how this work has changed or taught you? I have the feeling that every book teaches us something.
Yeah.
And I know that you're now, even as you were saying earlier, moving into other geographies of memorialization, other wakes of violent histories. And so I wonder what your capacity to see and hear is doing in and to you, if that makes sense.
I think I've become, thank you for that, and I think I've become a much better listener. I think that it's interesting, poetry, I first came into becoming a writer through poetry. I first came in through the sort of like performance poetry landscape, through spoken word, through slam poetry, and the lens through which at least I experienced slam in those, my early 20s was like that of commentary, right? It was having to say something about the world before you or the histories behind you. And then I sort of stepped off the stage in some ways to think because I found myself, everything that has happened in my life has happened, everything good that has happened in my writing life is because of the spoken word and slam poetry community, and I wouldn't be the writer I am without it. And I also, after a few years, you can find yourself writing the same type of poem all the time because it's like you have 3 minutes, and so all my poems were like 2 minutes and 58 seconds. And so I was like, sometimes I wanted the space to just be like, this is supposed to be a short poem, or this is supposed to be a 10-minute poem, or but then what that did was I think it made poetry became less about a commentary and more about paying attention. I think I became really good at paying attention because it was suddenly not me and an audience, it was like me and the page. And so I was paying attention, it was almost a way of like documenting and creating time capsules to capture how I understood what I was seeing in the world and in my own life. And so it went from sort of commentary to meditation, and How the Word is Passed began as a sort of meditative project. It was me going to these historical sites and sort of doing a sort of silent, personal reflection on who I was in relationship to these landscapes and these histories. And I think at some point I realized that the story I was trying to tell needed to exist beyond my voice. It was not meant to just be a sort of personal meditation on my relationship to these parts of history. If I was trying to understand how the different stories of these histories have come to be, then I had to include a multitude of voices beyond my own. So then it became more about listening, right? And so then I feel like I moved from commentary to meditation to listening, and I think that my work now is attempting to sort of triangulate all of those, right? It's trying to bring all of those in conversation with one another. But I think I've become like this type of writing, the experience of like going to a place and meeting people and listening to their stories and putting their stories in conversation with my own life and my own observations, has pushed me to be a much deeper listener than I ever have. As we were talking about before, I just got back from Rwanda like 72 hours ago. I'm working on a story for The Atlantic about how Rwanda memorializes the genocide that happened there in 1994. This is the 30th anniversary of a genocide in which 800,000 people died over the course of 3 months. And it was a sort of, when I was there, and I listened to the stories of people who survived, you know, and were like in the church, and they're pointing to a pew. They're like, that's the pew that I hid under. And I like covered myself in the bodies of my family members so that the militia couldn't see me. Or we will go to a school, and they were like, that's where I hid behind the desk and pretended to be dead so that they would move to the next classroom. There was like a level of listening and a level of attentiveness that I had to bring to that I think, in some ways, everything that we do as writers prepares us for what we come to next. And I don't think I could have been the sort of listener or been as attentive and as present as I hope I was able to be for that week that I was in Rwanda, had I not done How the Word Is Passed, had I not done all these, you know, experienced what it means to practice listening in a way that is less interested in, you know, defensiveness, or less interested in centering like my own voice or my own, but really being fully there to hear the story of someone else. And so when you say like, how has this work changed me? I think I am in my writing life and probably also in my personal life. You have to ask my wife, I don't know. I think I'm a better listener than I was before. She might be like, that's not true. But I think I've discovered the benefit of like just listening and asking questions, rather than attempting to insert my own perspective or my own, you know, and not that those are absent, but I think oftentimes in my work now I am foregrounding other people's voices, foregrounding the stories and when my voice is present, it's more in the space of inquiry rather than commentary. And I think I'm a different writer in that way than I was, you know, 5 years ago or so.
Mm-hmm. It'd be exciting. I know we have to go to questions, but we get to go to questions. I mean, don't have to. But I always have more questions for you. But when I think about that, listening without preempting, without defending, without being just too disturbed to hear, and I think immediately what comes to mind are all those other phrases we've been taught to obey and respect. Come on, put it behind you, don't wallow in it. That was ages ago. Mm-hmm. And so there's a way that America has been prohibited from the kind of reflective witnessing, storytelling, and also listening that survivors in Rwanda are healing by way of.
And and I think that in hearing, I'm thinking about the survivors in the context of Rwanda, but like to bring it all the way back to the beginning of our conversation, I think I learned to do that when I was like listening to my grandfather tell me his story, right, of a different type of survivorship, like what it means to survive 1930 Jim Crow Mississippi, right, or my grandmother talking about surviving 1940 Jim Crow Florida. And it's, you know, the stories of survival take on so many different forms and manifestations, and sometimes it's a question of just being willing to ask and to listen without centering or inserting yourself too much. Yeah. I think we got a few minutes for questions if anybody has them. Can be. No, my family's here, so it's like he's like.
I apologize. I've been stalking him since he was born.
That's true. This is my uncle Bruce.
My question is this. Listening to you, it brings emotion. You know, I'm a physician, and I don't consider myself to have found a cure for a social ill or ill amongst us, but what I see you guys doing is searching for a sort of an informational cure. You know, the stories that you tell are out there, and they're not heard until you find them and bring them forward. We live in a time now with a battle of truth and a definition of truth. And so my question is, how do you reckon with truth as you bring this truth forward? And I appreciate how you defend it as you present it with real stories, but I just wonder how you reckon with truth as it's perceived and how you deal with it when you bring it forth.
It's a really important question. In some ways, what does rise or present itself in the archive is useful in that respect, because, you know, the governor of Alabama has this on the webpage. This is part of the state history, even though it doesn't necessarily flatter that administration. It's an artifact of a form of engagement. And with the right kind of ears and heart, we can learn more from it than was possible in its time. And that feels really useful. You know, in some ways, even though there are seasons when truth is contested, there are always these seasons. There is no shelf life on truth. It is eminently and permanently useful and necessary. And so in some ways, going back toward what has been discarded can be a really useful first step. But what do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always really interested in like what it means to hold multiple truths, what it means to, you know, one of the first chapter of How the Word is Passed is about Monticello, the home of Thomas Jefferson, and I think that, you know, one of the reasons I wanted to go to Monticello is because I think that it is a sort of microcosm of the American project, which is that America is a place that has provided millions and millions of people opportunities for upward mobility and access to resources and life chances in ways that their ancestors could have never imagined. But it has also done so at the direct expense of millions and millions of other people who have been intergenerationally subjugated and oppressed, or as Tracy writes, like the free and the freed is a different way to think about it. And, you know, and Jefferson is someone who I think embodies the cognitive dissonance of the American project. He's someone who enslaved over 600 people over the course of his lifetime, including 4 of his own children, and is someone who wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. He's someone who wrote in, you know, the notes on the state of Virginia that black people are inherently inferior to whites in both endowments of body and mind, that the slave was incapable of love to the same extent their white counterparts were. And so what I'm interested in is like, how can we think about what it means to hold both of those Americas alongside one another, and to recognize that these types of truths aren't mutually exclusive from one another? Because I think that people feel like it's like either you have like, you know, the woke truth, you know, I hate the way that it's become such a derisive term, but like the woke truth or the, you know, American truth, or the black truth or the white truth, or and it's, what's true is that like oftentimes these things sit alongside one another, not without tension, but they do sit along and need to sit alongside one another, and we have to hold them as such.
Yeah, and they give birth to one another too, which is a really interesting
So last question.
Yeah.
Thank you both. I love how you both highlight the importance of personal narrative. Clint, you talked about how you were interviewing all these people, and then you're like, why am I not interviewing my own family members? And you have the letters. I am a professor here at Tulane and lived through and experienced Katrina, and something that was so powerful to me was in the HBO documentary, Katrina Babies. And
so good.
These children are 12 and 16, and they sit down in front of the camera, and they said, "You're the first person to ever ask me about my story."
Yeah.
And living in New Orleans, I think a lot of us, you know, saw the pain up close, and I have a lot of privilege. I did not experience as much pain, but I have seen the pain through other people's eyes. And I just, for both of you, how would you encourage the continual, maybe in a college classroom, I'm a professor here at Tulane, how can we encourage people to share those personal narratives in the both and, because people are uncomfortable with pain, but even in the college classroom, or even in our neighborhoods, communities, and homes. I love the comment about becoming a better listener, but anything else y'all could share about just giving people the opportunity to share their pain in a world that we live in and that is so polarized. It feels like there's not a lot of oxygen in the room for people to share their pain, and we can all learn so much through those personal narratives.
Yeah. When I was traveling as poet laureate, I had a project which was really simple. I would take poems by other living American poets and go into spaces and read them with strangers and say, what do you notice? And poems are really great intermediaries because to read about another person's experience of joy or loss, or inevitably the blurring of that and much else, opens up memory, realization, and an ability to talk into those difficult or hot spots. That's really useful and very immediate. And in relatively short amount of time, we found ourselves opening up. So, a poem about losing a relative, or a poem about, surviving a kind of trauma, allowed someone to say, oh, this reminds me of when this happened. And it was such a beautiful reverence that came into the room. And I really think that's a very easy first step, because it might not be that you want to tell your story right away, but to let your story bump up against the story of the speaker in a poem is a really interesting and useful invitation. And I recommend it. And I also just think even the way that you write about what the realization of being in the presence of history and the processing that happens, that also makes something possible, even if it's just something welling up in the reader. And I feel like we need to have places where we can talk, not argue, and not also, feel the need to shout one another down and defend things, which almost every other space in our culture insists and encourages. But to say, oh, I saw this, it makes me think of that, it makes me miss this person, or grateful for that. I think that's a huge part of the human exchange that we've sacrificed without realizing it.
Yeah, and I would just add, this is like the former high school teacher, me coming out, like as a pedagogical maneuver, I've found it to be much more effective I think using the poem as an entry point is a really excellent idea. Sometimes it could be a poem, sometimes it could be a film, but instead of going straight from the thing to now let's sit as a group, or a seminar and discuss it. But I did this with 14-year-olds, but I think it's also relevant to 21-year-olds, going from that to a personal reflection first, right? Because, it doesn't matter if you're in a classroom of 7th graders or seniors in college, if you do that, you're gonna have the same 3 kids who always are ready to talk, gonna be talking amongst one another. But instead, if you give people 10, 15 minutes to write and to have their response to the poem, or to have their response to the film, a free write, a poem, whatever it takes on, and then you go to small groups, right? One other person or 2 other people, groups of 2 or 3, and they're discussing their responses among themselves, and then bringing it after that to a larger group. I found that you have students who are prepared, who they need a different kind of time. Some of us process out loud, I'm somebody who processes out loud. That's why I'm very long-winded, and I'm just oh, that's what I was trying to say, but it's 5 minutes later. But some people need to process within themselves and on the page, and otherwise they're gonna feel paralyzed and stuck and they don't have anything to say. And they do have something to say. But I think in the safe space, not safe space, but in the space of having time for themselves and then doing it in the sort of lower pressure context of 2 or 3 people off to the side before coming to the larger group, I think I've found that can be a really effective way of generating a type of engagement that might otherwise be there.
Beautiful.
Yeah. And I think that's it.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much for coming.